You're live. So you should press end stream the red button when you are done going live. You're not on camera.
Hello, boys and girls.
No, it doesn't work like that. It does. It's just the camera doesn't work like that. Stop.
Doesn't work at all. What the hell?
It just doesn't work like that. Read.
It's like aimed at
It's
freaking
live. Read.
dinosaur.
Read. No one cares what you see. Just read what you read.
Hello, men and women.
Just read. So
boys
part
and
one.
girls. The obligations of the parties. Analysis of performance under Article 2 is heavily dependent on a firm understanding of the contract terms. Once you have mastered the approach of identifying contract terms introduced in Chapters 6 through 8, you are ready to define the obligations of the parties. You will then be ready to analyze contract performance by comparing what the parties actually did to what they are obligated to do. As you learned in the previous chapters, the parties' total legal obligation arises from their agreement, which consists of both express and implied terms, including warranties. The code also includes specific provisions that, unless otherwise agreed, outline the parties' respective performance obligations. The starting point is Section 2301, which states that the seller's obligation is to transfer and deliver the goods, and the buyer's obligation is to accept and pay for them in accordance with the contract. The official comment to Section 2301 emphasizes that to determine what is in accordance with the contract,
What's the seller gotta do?
with the usage of trade, course of dealing, and performance, and the general background of circumstances must be given due consideration in conjunction with the lay meaning of the words used to define the scope of conditions and duties.
Got it. Seller has the obligation to transfer and deliver. Buyer has the obligation to accept and pay.
Obligations of the parties.
Got it. Next.
Usually, unless the contract provides otherwise, we expect the seller to tender goods before the buyer's obligation to pay arises. However, because Section 2301 basically makes tender and acceptance constructive concurrent conditions, unless the contract expressly provides otherwise, if a seller fails to tender, the buyer must tender performance before the seller will be in breach of contract. All right, Section 2, Contract Performance. Article 2 takes an ordered approach to performance. TIARRC Figure 9.3 can help you remember how to approach contract performance analysis. However, the exact order of your analysis will not necessarily follow this list, as you will see in discussion that follows. So, Figure 9.3 TIARRC stands for tender, inspection, acceptance, rejection, revocation of acceptance, and cure. Section 2.1, Tender. The performance analysis begins with the seller's tender of delivery. The code does not define tender, but it does prescribe the appropriate steps for a tender of delivery of the goods. Section 2503 states that tender of delivery requires that the seller put and hold conforming goods as the buyer's disposition. However, you may be somewhat confused to learn that tender occurs when the seller makes the goods available to the buyer, even if the goods are non-conforming. Perhaps the best way to understand the meaning of tender is to view it as the seller's outward manifestation of willingness to deliver the goods to the buyer. When the sale takes place face-to-face, tender is accomplished when the seller makes the goods available to the buyer to take them away. When the goods are to be shipped, depending on the nature of the contract, tender occurs either when the seller delivers the goods to the carrier or when the carrier delivers the goods to the buyer. Unless there is a contrary specific provision in a contract, the code's default provisions require the seller to transfer and deliver the goods to the buyer in accordance with the contract, regardless of anything else in the contract requires. At a minimum, this means that the seller must tender conforming goods. Conforming is a term of art defined in section 2106. Goods are conforming or conform to the contract when they are in accordance with the obligations under the contract. The seller's tender is a constructive condition to the buyer's obligation to pay for the goods. If the seller never tenders, the buyer's performance obligation does not arise. If the seller tenders in accordance with the contract, the buyer's obligations to pay become due in accordance with the contract terms. If the seller's tender conforms to the contract, the buyer is obligated to accept and pay for the goods. If the seller's tender fails to conform to the contract, the performance analysis depends on whether the contract is an installment contract or a single lot delivery contract. In any event, unless the contract provides otherwise before payment, the buyer has a right to determine if the goods conform to the contract. Hence, the next step in contract performance analysis is inspection. Section 2.2, Inspection and Conformance. Section 2513 describes the buyer's right to inspect goods. Inspection gives the buyer the opportunity to determine whether goods are conforming, which will determine whether the buyer is obligated to accept and pay for the goods. Whether a buyer inspects within a reasonable time is a question of fact, whose resolution may determine whether a buyer has lost the right to reject non-conforming goods. Section 2.3, Acceptance. Previously in this course, we discussed acceptance in the context of contract formation. The code now uses the word acceptance again, but this time in the context of contract performance. Be sure that you do not get confused by the two uses of the same word. Okay. I love all this.
No footnotes. No.
Okay. Acceptance of an offer results in a contract. Okay. Acceptance in this chapter occurs after contract formation and refers to acceptance of goods after the seller's tender of delivery and has different legal effects. Okay. Under section 6, acceptance can occur in three different ways. You can think of the first way as an act of acceptance, which occurs when the buyer, after a reasonable opportunity to inspect the goods, signifies to the seller that the goods are conforming or that he will take or retain them in spite of their non-conformity. The second way is where the buyer fails to make an effective rejection. The third way is when the acceptance occurs through acts inconsistent with the seller's ownership. You can think of the last two ways as passive acceptance. Acceptance is a major milestone in contract performance. Its legal effects, which are listed in section 2607, include that the buyer must pay at the contract rate for goods accepted. The buyer can no longer reject the goods, and the burden is now on the buyer to establish any breach with respect to acceptance goods. Section 2.4, Rejection. A buyer's right to reject demand depends on whether the contract is an installment contract or a contract that calls for delivery in a single lot. In other words, a single lot delivery contract. Section 2.4.1, Rejection in an installment contract. Section 2612 defines installment contracts and sets forth the rules governing performance of installment contracts. Section 2612 defines an installment contract as one that requires or authorizes the delivery of goods in separate lots to be separately accepted. Section 2612, Part 2, states the rule for rejection in such contracts that the buyer may reject any installment which is non-conforming if the non-conformity substantially impairs the value of that installment and cannot be cured. However, if the non-conformity does not fall within subsection and the seller gives adequate assurance of its cure, the buyer must accept that installment. Figure 9.4 shows the steps that are followed to analyze contract performance of an installment contract when the seller's tender is non-conforming. If you work through the language of Section 2612, Part 2, you will quickly see that the section makes it extremely difficult for a buyer to reject an installment of non-conforming goods. Rejection is permitted only if the non-conformity substantially impairs the value of that installment and the non-conformity is not curable. That standard is rarely met. Although the code does not define substantial impairment of value, the Universal Commercial Code scholars suggest that the concept is analogous to substantial performance under the restatement second of contracts. Section 241 of the restatement provides a test balancing the following factors: the extent to which the injured party will be deprived of the benefit which he reasonably expected.
Never mind.
So, figure 9.4 on page 189 explains the performance of installment contract when seller's tender is non-conforming. Seller begins performance of installment contract, also known as tender. Effect of a seller's tender: the buyer must accept goods if non-conformity does not substantially impair the value of that installment and can be cured. To satisfy buyer or reseller's ability to cure, buyer may make a demand for adequate assurances of due performance. Seller's cure, installment contract continues, continued nonconformities, breach of the whole, followed by remedies. The extent to which the injured party can be compensated for the part of that benefit of which he will be deprived. The extent to which the party failing to perform or to offer to perform will suffer forfeiture. The likelihood that the party failing to perform or to offer to perform will cure his failure, taking account of all the circumstances, including any reasonable assurances, and the extent to which the behavior of the party failing to perform or to offer to perform comports with standards of good faith and fair dealing.
Yeah.
What's it say?
My handwriting?
I don't think so, but I don't.
Substantial impairment of value.
The criteria for declaring a breach of the whole installment contract are set forth in Section 2612, Part 3. The aggrieved party must demonstrate that nonconformity or default with respect to one or more installments substantially impairs the value of the whole contract. Official Comment 6 to Section 2612, Part 3 explains that subsection 3 is designed to further the continuance of the contract in the absence of an overt cancellation. Accordingly, an analysis of breach of the whole contract under Section 2612, Part 3 often includes a demand for adequate assurances of performance under Section 2609. Oh. Page 190, section 2.4.2. Rejection in a single lot delivery contract. Figures 9.5 and 9.6 shown on page 191 show the complex analysis of performance of a single lot delivery contract when the seller's tender is non-conforming. As figure 9.5 illustrates, after you decide that you are dealing with a non-conforming tender, the next step is to see whether the contract contains a remedy limitation provision. If so, the contract provisions, rather than section 2601, will govern the buyer's options upon receipt of the non-conforming tender. In other words, if there is a valid remedy limitation provision in the contract, the buyer must seek the exclusive remedy provided in the contract and cannot reject goods even if they are non-conforming. Barring such a contract provision, until a buyer accepts the goods, the buyer has the right under section 2601 to reject non-conforming goods, and if the goods fail in any respect to conform to the contract, the buyer may reject the whole or any commercial unit or units. Under section 2602, rejection must be within a reasonable time after delivery or tender and is ineffective unless the buyer reasonably notifies the seller. Section 2601 is often referred to as the perfect tender rule. However, the buyer's right to reject is tempered by the seller's right to cure. So, figure 9.5, buyer's response to non-conforming tender when contract has a remedy limitation. Seller tenders non-conforming goods. In turn, does the contract contain a remedy limitation provision? If no, the buyer may accept or reject the goods. If yes, does the contract make that remedy limitation buyer's exclusive remedy? If no, buyer can resort to all code remedies, including right to reject under section 2601. If the contract does make that remedy limitation buyer's exclusive, buyer cannot reject. Buyer must allow seller to cure by performing contract remedy. After cure, seller tenders conforming goods, or seller is unable to or fails to tender conforming goods. Thus, the remedy limitation fails of its essential purpose, and the buyer has recourse to all code remedies, including revocation of acceptance, as per section 2719, part 2. And figure 9.6 on page 192 explains if the buyer's response to non-conforming tender when contract does not have remedy limitation. Seller tenders non-conforming goods. Did the buyer accept? If yes, legal ramifications as per section 2607. Does buyer have the right to revoke acceptance? Only if nonconformity substantially impairs the value to buyer. The buyer accepted either A, knowing of the nonconformity under the assumption that it would be cured, or B, because the nonconformity was non-apparent at the time of acceptance. If the buyer did not accept the seller's tenders of nonconforming goods, does the buyer still have the right to reject? Single lot contract says if the goods or tender fail to conform in any respect, then there's to be a notice or a cure. As for installment contracts, the buyer has the right to reject only if nonconformity substantially impairs the value to buyer and 2 cannot be cured. Thus, the right to reject installment and the right to reject the whole of the single lot contract. All right. How does the court apply the perfect tender rule? Okay, never mind. Casper Sets versus Clark's Landing Marina Inc. Per curiam. Plaintiff Hans J. Casper Sets filed a 7-count complaint against defendants, including Clark's Landing Marina Inc., alleging, among other things, breach of contract, breach of warranty, and violation of consumer protection laws. The claims arise from Clark's warranty. Oh, I'm sorry. The claims arise from Clark's Landing sale to plaintiff of a customized 38-foot Lures fishing boat with twin Yanmar motors for a purchase price of $386,500. The law division judge granted Clark's Landing's motion for summary judgment. Thereafter, plaintiff filed a motion for non-reconsideration. All right. After a file motion for reconsideration, which was denied, this appeal followed. We affirm. On February 6, 2004, while at the Atlantic City Boat Show, plaintiff signed a conditional sales agreement with Clark's Landing. He paid a $2,000 deposit in order to secure a production slot for May 2004, which was later that spring at the Lures facility. After plaintiff made custom selections, a revised contract was executed. As Clark's Landing requires in special order boats, he paid a non-refundable deposit of $15,000 by credit card on May 1st, 2004. Plaintiff's special order boat arrived at Clark's Landing on September 2nd, 2004, just later that fall. After, according to the plaintiff, delivery was delayed several times, Lures retail invoice to Clark's Landing was for $319,471.50, including $19,871.50 in custom options. Clark's Landing paid this amount to Lures by check dated September 2nd, 2004. Prior to leaving the Lures factory, a crack had been discovered in the boat's bell housing, which is a large cone-shaped piece between the motor and the transmission. The crack was repaired by Yanmar. Clark's Landing was not informed of the crack or the repair. Before accepting delivery, plaintiff commissioned a boat survey, which was performed on September 7, 2004. Plaintiff notified Clark's Landing of the 41 deficiencies discovered in the survey. Clark's Landing agreed to correct the deficiencies, which were mainly cosmetic. Plaintiff then advised Clark's Landing that he would not accept delivery on the boat until the following year because it arrived so late in the boating season. Clark's Landing refused to hold the boat in inventory for that length of time and told plaintiff that he would forfeit his $15,000 deposit if he did not accept the boat. Closing on the boat was conducted on September 24, 2004. Not all the deficiencies had been corrected, but Clark's Landing assured plaintiff that the list of repairs would be completed. At closing, plaintiff signed a separate document acknowledging that limited warranties were provided solely by the boat manufacturer, not by Clark's Landing, and that Clark's Landing would perform only those repairs authorized by the manufacturer. The sales contract included a disclaimer by Clark's Landing of any and all warranties, expressed or implied, including any implied warranty of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. The disclaimer specified that all warranties were extended solely by the manufacturers. The limited warranty provided by lure is restricted a buyer's remedy to repair or
Are you
replace.
reading a case? You're reading a case.
Yeah, yeah.
Skip the case.
Why am I skipping the case?
Because we're just reading substantive material.
Okay.
So all you have to do is revocation of acceptance and cure.
Section 2.5, Revocation of Acceptance. Revocation of acceptance is a new name introduced by Article 2 to cover a situation where a buyer of goods has accepted the goods and subsequently, I can read that in my head, trust me, wants to undo the contract and return the goods to the seller without liability for breach. Official comment 1 to Section 2608 explains that the section purposely does not use the term rescission. Okay, it's a known. Because of possible and ambiguous or confusing meanings. The standard for revoking acceptance of non-conforming goods is higher than that required for rejection. Whereas a buyer can reject goods in a single lot delivery contract if the goods or the tender fail in any respect to conform to the contract. If the goods or the tender fail in any respect to conform to the contract, a buyer can revoke acceptance only if the nonconformity of the goods substantially impairs the value of the goods to the buyer in two situations. One, where the buyer knowingly has accepted nonconforming goods on the reasonable assumption that the seller would cure the nonconformity and the seller has failed to do so. And two, where the buyer has unknowingly accepted the nonconforming goods either because the nonconformity was not readily ascertainable when the goods were first delivered, or because the seller's assurances, often in the form of remedy limitation provisions such as a promise to repair or replace defective parts, the buyer's right to revoke is further limited because it must occur within a reasonable time after the buyer discovers or should have discovered the ground for it and before any substantial change in the condition of the goods, not caused by the defect. To effectively revoke acceptance, a buyer must notify the seller of the revocation. Thereafter, the revoking buyer has the same rights and duties with regard to the goods involved as if he had rejected them. There is an issue regarding whether that means the seller would have a right to cure after a buyer revokes acceptance, since a buyer who rejects goods must give the seller an opportunity to cure. Arguably, a buyer who revokes acceptance has that same obligation. However, since one of the basis for revoking acceptance is that buyer accepted non-conforming goods based on a reasonable assumption that there would be a cure, and that the defect has not been seasonably cured, it seems inefficient to again force a revoking buyer to give a seller yet another opportunity to cure. One possible interpretive solution to this problem is to provide that if a buyer revokes under Section 2608, the seller does not have an opportunity to cure, but if the buyer revokes under Section 2608, the seller does have such an opportunity.
Just read the last section.
Okay, so let me go over that sentence one more time.
No.
One possible interpretive solution to this problem is to provide that if a buyer revokes under Section 2608 1 Part A, the seller does not have an opportunity to cure. But if the buyer revokes under Section 2608 1 Part B, the seller does have such an opportunity. Section 2.6 Cure. Section 2, 508 gives a seller who has made a non-conforming tender an opportunity to replace that tender with a conforming tender in two situations. One, where the non-conforming tender is made before the time for performance has expired, and two, where the non-conforming tender is made after the time for performance has expired. So one before and one after. But the seller had reasonable grounds to believe that the non-conforming tender would be acceptable. In the latter case, the seller has a further reasonable time to substitute a conforming tender. Okay? No, that last paragraph is pretty easy. I can explain that.